Hi, 8th graders. Welcome back. Today we are continuing Unit 3, where we're learning about Louisiana after Reconstruction all the way until the present. We're still learning about the Civil Rights Movement today, where we'll learn about sit-ins. If you have not already, please finish your do now. And let's review. Question number 1 says, in Plessy versus Ferguson, so whenever we see a name V or VS, another one, that means it's a court case. This is a Supreme Court case. In Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896, the U.S. Supreme Court decided that a Louisiana law mandating separate but equal accommodations for blacks and whites on interstate railroads was constitutional. The United States Supreme Court decision in Plessy versus Ferguson influenced the political and social history of Louisiana by, the correct answer here is C, making segregation legal. The next best answer was A, beginning segregation in the state, but Plessy versus Ferguson did not start segregation. This is just the time when the U.S. Supreme Court weighed in on the idea and said, yes, this is a legal thing. Technically, Plessy versus Ferguson said that segregation is legal because it's separate and equal, meaning blacks and whites receive the same level of quality of streetcars or public facilities. We know that in reality, it was not equal. And that's why Brown versus Board of Education, which you learned about yesterday, struck down this court case. So after Brown versus Board of Education, Plessy versus Ferguson was undone. The next question, what effect did the system of sharecropping have on Louisiana after the Civil War? We learned about sharecropping and how A, it kept formerly enslaved people economically dependent on rich planters. Remember, they continued to work on the land that their slaveholders once owned, and they were not allowed to leave the land until they paid off their debt, and oftentimes they were never able to make enough money to pay off their debts. We're going to skip these and flip over to our historian hustle. Push next when you've answered all the questions on your paper. All right, let's review. And our hustle terms are all terms that'll help us do better on our unit test on Thursday. So take these hustle terms home with you every night and study them. The better you do on your hustle, the better you'll do on your test. So check and change your answers. And moving on. All right, flip your papers over to our hook, our framing the lesson. In 2016, at least 258 Black people were killed by police. Right now on your paper, I want you to write about how many of these deaths were reported on by major news outlets. For the deaths that were widely reported on in the news, what was the impact? Did it get people talking about race and police brutality? Did it spark protests or movements for change? Explain your answer. So far, what we should be thinking about is in 2016, we did learn about some of the people who were killed by police. Alton Sterling was one of the major names that came out in 2016, also Philando Castile. So we definitely did not learn about 250 people who died, but we did learn some major names. And when we think about what did this do, it did start a lot of conversations about race. It started a lot of protests and movements. The Black Lives Matter movement gained a lot more followers and also a lot more enemies as a result of those killings. All right, your third question. What about the deaths that were not reported? What was the impact of those deaths on the American people? Did they get people talking about race and police brutality? Did they spark protests or movements for change? Explain. Yeah, and so whenever we think about the people who were not killed or not reported on, their deaths didn't really do much on a national scene. It didn't spark a lot of conversation because people didn't even know about it. And so, one of the things we want to be thinking about is what is the impact of the media on the things that we choose to care about? We chose to care a lot about race relations when we heard about Philando Castile and about Alton Sterling in 2016, but there were hundreds more people who died that same year for the same reasons that we didn't talk about at all. When the media chooses to highlight something, it helps us choose what we want to focus on. We're going to keep that idea in mind as we learn more about the civil rights movement. And we're going to ask ourselves, what impact did the media play on the civil rights movement? And we're going to see also that a lot of civil rights leaders deliberately used the media to help advance their message. So the compelling question for the day is, how does the media contribute to reform movements? And we can think about this in the context of the civil rights movement of the past, as well as movements today. Write down today's aim. I will be able to describe the sit-ins and the role media played in shaping public opinion of the movement. All right. So, in the civil rights movement, a new tactic to fight racism began, and this tactic was called a sit-in. A sit-in is a form of protest where a person sits in a restaurant that won't serve them and they refuse to leave until they're served or forcibly removed. So, a little bit more about this time because it doesn't make a lot of sense to us today. Today, we can all go into any restaurant we want and we're going to get served as long as we have reservations or there's space for us. Back in the 1960s and before that, a lot of lunch restaurants in the South separated by race. They said either like only white people can eat inside this building, or maybe white people can eat in the front side and black people have to eat in the back. People began to question this. So the Greensboro sit-ins, this is the first time where a group of black teens go into a restaurant and they say, we are not getting up until we're served. So it's a sit-in. It was a form of nonviolent protest, also known as civil disobedience. So civil disobedience is whenever you choose to break a law that you disagree with as a form of protest. It's a peaceful form of protest. So here we see these are some of the original Greensboro sit-ins. These people went to a place called Woolworths and they sat down. This is in North Carolina. They sat down at the restaurant and they said, we will not leave this lunch counter until you serve us. The white owners refused to serve them, so they just sat there. Eventually, the police had to be called on them and they were carted out. But they continued by doing this, they gained a lot of media attention and people started paying attention and asking themselves questions like, hey, why are people who are black not allowed to eat at this restaurant when they have money and they're willing to pay? Here we see over time, more and more media exposure got people realizing that these sit-ins were a really good idea. So the sit-ins grew. This entire lunch counter at Woolworths is filled with Black people trying to get served, but being refused because of their skin color. Sit-ins usually ended with the protesters being arrested. During these protests, the idea of nonviolent resistance was very important. People reading the news articles or watching the arrests on television saw the police brutally beating these peaceful protesters. So this helped the movement gain more support from otherwise ambivalent whites. So one of the ideas with this is we are going to sit at these lunch counters. We will get arrested. We understand that because we are breaking the law. But when we get arrested, we're going to be peaceful about it. The police officers, on the other hand, were very violent about it. They would often beat people or drag them out, and the news would take pictures of this. They would film this. White people who didn't really want to take a side in all of this started seeing this and seeing there's a clear bad guy here, and the bad guy is white people who are insisting on segregation. So more people began to join the civil rights movement and began to fight against segregation. Here we see some police violently beating someone from a sit-in. Here's a woman being dragged. She's, again, non-violently protesting here. So these sit-ins happened all around the South, and New Orleans was one of the popular destinations for these sit-ins. During this time, Canal Street used to be the place where everyone would go to shop. And so many stores on Canal Street, such as McCrory's, and we also had a Woolworths, they were protested in New Orleans. We even have a street in New Orleans named after one of these famous protesters. Her name was Aretha Castle, and she did marry another civil rights person with the last name of Haley. And so today we have the street Aretha Castle Haley, named after a woman who participated in these protests, these sit-in protests in New Orleans. This building right here is actually the KIPP New Orleans building. It's on Aretha Castle Haley. All right, you have 4 questions. Write your answers on your paper. All right, flip your papers over. We are going to continue answering our compelling question of how does the media contribute to reform movements? So we're continuing to think about those sit-ins, and we want to be thinking about what role did the media, the news organizations play to help these reform movements. Our first source is a video. And the questions we want to be thinking about as we watch the video. Number 1, why was Woolworths chosen for the first sit-in? Why would the Greensboro Four intentionally buy school supplies before starting their sit-in? And number 3, what role did TV and newspapers play in the growth and spread of sit-ins? So let's watch that video.
The food was bland, the coffee weak, the atmosphere sterile. But the stools in this lunch counter are more treasured and more symbolic than any seat in a five-star restaurant. What was served up at this very counter was the sweet and satisfying taste of freedom. This was the main stage of one of the greatest dramas of the 1960s, the so-called sit-in civil rights protest. It was about 80 feet long and 24 inches wide, an L-shaped lunch counter that occupied the northeast corner of F.W. Woolworth in Greensboro, North Carolina. The countertop looked like elegant black marble or slate with polished edges, but this was a faux finish. Beneath the counter was a long piece of stainless steel for parking your knees or your old chewing gum. The stools were classic diner pieces, covered with vinyl, backed with chrome. One other feature of these stools made a lot of people uncomfortable. You could only sit on them if you were white. It wasn't an official company-wide Woolworth policy, but each store manager was allowed to segregate the counter if he chose to, and the department store giant was a landmark of Main Street America. So when 4 young Greensboro men wanted to challenge the invisible color line, Woolworth's was where they went.
It was by design that we came to this place. We wanted a place where there was really a dichotomy of offering and treatment and respect to people simply based on their color.
The date was February 1st, 1960. The 4 teenagers, freshmen at a local university, entered Woolworth's and began shopping for school supplies. It was a calculated move, meant to point out the hypocrisy of a store which would accept their money at the checkout, but not at the lunch counter. Receipts in hand, 2 by 2, they approached the forbidden stools.
All around this room, the bottom lips of the patrons were dropping, and people were just absolutely standing and staring and looking as though they were fixed in time.
McCain expected to be cracked over the head, hauled off to jail, or both. And sure enough, a police officer soon appeared.
And he started to pace the counter back and forth, and as he walked back and forth, he started to pound his nightstick in his hand. But after he paced 3 times with his nightstick, I said to myself, we've got him. He really doesn't know what to do.
The Greensboro Four, they would soon be called: David Richmond, Franklin McCain, Ezell Blair, and Joseph McNeil. The defiance and pride visible on their faces would be severely tested in the months ahead. Every day, the Greensboro Four and a growing number of black and white supporters returned to the lunch counter. Taking shifts, they occupied the counter stools all day, enduring insults and threats from hostile bystanders. With newspapers, television, and radio closely following the protest, sit-ins spread throughout the South. Segregated lunch counters in 54 cities were taken over by the protesters. Still, the management of the Greensboro Woolworths stuck by its guns, and the corporate bosses kept out of it. For 6 months, protesters and waitresses glared at each other across this counter. Finally, on July 25th, 1960, the F.W. Woolworth Company ordered the Greensboro store to give in. Throughout the department store chain, the lunch counters were officially desegregated.
As time went on, it ceased to matter because
All right, so with that video, we're now going to answer these 3 questions. Why was Woolworths chosen for the first sit-in? Why did they bring their school supplies? And then what role did TV and newspapers play? And let's review. So why was Woolworths chosen for the first sit-in? Because it was a chain, a national chain that refused to serve Black customers at their lunch counter. Why did the Greensboro Four intentionally buy school supplies before starting their sit-in? It was both to show that they were productive members of society, they were students, but then also because it showed that they were capable of paying for things at Woolworths. They were able to buy the school supplies. They were also able to buy the food. And then the last one, what role did TV and newspapers play in the growth and spread of sit-ins? It helps show images of peaceful, nonviolent protesters of segregation being abused by police. So it helped gain more support of Black Americans as well as white Americans who may have not actually taken a side otherwise. All right, flip over to source 2. These are 10 rules of conduct for sit-ins. So people like Martin Luther King Jr. and others who were leading protests around the country, they all gave these 10 rules for people protesting in a sit-in. And it was expected that if you were going to protest by sitting in, you would follow these rules. I'm going to read these rules aloud with you. It says, do. Show yourself friendly and courteous, which means polite, at all times. Sit straight up. Always face the counter. 3. Report all serious incidents to your leader. 4. Refer information seekers to your leader in a polite manner. 5. Remember the teachings of Jesus Christ, Mahatma Gandhi, and Martin Luther King. Love and nonviolence is the way. Do not strike back or curse if abused. Laugh out. Hold conversations with a floor walker. Leave your seat until your leader has given you permission to do so. Or block entrances to stores outside nor the aisles inside. Oops. So using this, answer your 3 questions. And the answers to all are on here. So number 1, why was Woolworths chosen? Oops. Why would these rules be needed? So why were these 10 rules needed? It was to control the message that the news was able to report on the protesters. If people were following these rules, then they were more likely to get good news coverage. Whereas if people didn't follow rules or people were doing whatever they want, they would not be able to control the message that the news was reporting out. Number 2, why do you think it was important that the protesters were seen as polite? This helped other people encourage them to join the cause. And then finally, in what ways could the whole movement be hurt if one person broke the rule? It would allow the media or people against integration to characterize those people as violent. So we see that even today with the Black Lives Matter movement, where someone will take a single incident. So I'm thinking of like after Alton Sterling and Philando Castile's murder, there was someone who shot police in Dallas, and he did it on behalf of the Black Lives Matter movement. This person was acting alone, though. He was not endorsed by the Black Lives Matter movement. But a lot of white people in America today were like, oh, the whole movement is violent because of the actions of this one man. So in order to prevent that from happening during the civil rights movement, they had these rules of conduct to tightly control the message and how people were able to perceive them. All right, source 3, you have a Woolworths counter protest picture, and it says fountain closed in interest of public safety. Answer these 3 questions. So number 1, what does the sign behind the men say? It says fountain closed in interest of public safety. Number 2, do you think the sit-in protesters are a danger to public safety? So this is a personal opinion, but we can see from these pictures and we know from the rules and we know from the history of these sit-ins that these people were not a danger to the people in the lunch counter. And so whenever we see this sign saying the fountains closed in the interest of public safety, we have to wonder, like, who are they worried about? Because these people sitting at the counter pose no danger. And then number 3, why do you think the photographer included the sign in this picture? And how might a picture like this influence people who saw it in the newspaper? So the photographer was making an intentional choice here. They were showing people nonviolently protesting and also showing Woolworth's interpretation of this, which was that it was dangerous. I believe that the photographer chose to show these 2 things to get Americans to start questioning, are these people actually dangerous? Woolworths may be telling you that they're dangerous, but I don't see any evidence to support it. So it's getting people to question what we've always accepted, which at the time was segregation. All right, if you flip to source 4 is a reading about the lunch counters in New Orleans. So read through those, and then questions on your exit ticket will be aligned to that. All right, and your exit ticket is in Illuminate. It's listed as exit ticket day 12, sit-ins. Y'all have a great day. Bye.